From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this Memorial Day weekend. I'm Tyne Morgan, and here's what's in store over the next 60 minutes. A glimpse at the state of the dairy industry as pressures mount for dairy farmers.
It says is that for the dairy producers that are still here, it's a dogfight. It is a street fight in terms of figuring out ways to stay relevant.
But some farmers are finding other ways to cash in, including with beef on dairy.
Today we have some of the highest on-farm prices for cattle that we've seen in history. Day-old beef calves are, selling for $900 to $1,000 right off of the farm.
And it's this young farmer who will help toast to a tradition at the Indy 500 this Memorial Day weekend. Plus a custom-built tractor that rides in memory of the man who built it.
He had a passion, and that passion was preserving the industrial history of our nation.
Celebrating him and the work he did to keep a tradition alive.
U.S. Farm Report, presented by Pioneer. What's next happens when the name on a cap matches the power of one's purpose. Pioneer. What's next happens here.
The House Ag Committee markup of the new $1.51 trillion farm bill started Thursday and didn't end until early Friday morning. The markup passed with a vote of 33 to 21, and that was with the help of 4 Democrats voting yes. The Ag Secretary sharing his own thoughts ahead of that markup process. Tom Vilsack telling reporters he has strong concerns about the ability to get the House Farm Bill proposal passed once it's out of committee. He pointed to several areas that may sabotage completion of the measure this year, including the price tag. The House bill has various provisions that could raise the cost, including higher reference prices. ARC coverage will be increased from 86% to 90%. Minimum ARC payments will increase 2.5%, and base acres will be raised. The secretary says this will have a budget impact of $30 billion that sets it up for failure.
The proposal being advanced by the House of Representatives, the Republican members of the Ag Committee, it really is designed not to create a route to passage, but I think it's designed, unfortunately, for a route to impasse.
To pay for the increased cost, the House proposal makes a change to Section 5 of the Commodity Credit Corporation. Vilsack says this will restrict its use for emergencies and natural disasters. Vilsack added that the House proposal will accelerate the consolidation of farms and instead advises use of the Senate Ag Committee proposal championed by Chair Debbie Stabenow, which he says may provide the only hope of getting a bill done yet in 2024. House Ag Committee Chairman G.T. Thompson releasing a statement after Secretary Vilsack shared his thoughts, saying, quote, "It's clear from this 11th hour push that the Secretary is determined to use every penny of the borrowing authority made available to him to circumvent Congress if left unchecked." The committee is reasserting Congress's authority over the Commodity Credit Corporation, which will bring reckless administrative spending under control and provides funding for key bipartisan priorities in the Farm Bill, end quote. Well, people are busy this holiday weekend cleaning up from powerful storms that hit the Midwest this week. In Iowa, the small city of Greenfield was hit by a massive tornado. The impact area described as massive, a local hospital among the buildings damaged. The governor of Iowa issuing a disaster proclamation for 15 counties and will apply for federal assistance.
I heard like a train, and then insulation came from the basement, and I knew it was hitting.
The storms moved eastward to pummel parts of Illinois and Wisconsin, knocking out power of tens of thousands of customers in 2 states. An update to avian flu H5N1 virus. A Michigan farm worker has now been diagnosed with avian flu, marking the second human case associated with the outbreak of H5N1 in dairy cattle. Health officials say the patient had mild symptoms. They say they were in contact with cows, and they also continue to say that the risk to the public remains low. The first human case involving dairy cattle happened in late March. That's when a farm worker in Texas was diagnosed. USDA is reporting 52 dairy herds in 9 states are impacted by avian flu, and they continue to say beef and dairy products are safe. That's it for the news. Well, from severe weather to a heat wave, we'll have a check of your forecast coming up next.
U.S. Farm Report weather is brought to you by H&S Manufacturing. With 5 models ranging from 1,300 to the large 4,200 gallon and the ability to provide an excellent spread pattern, H&S has a top shot side discharge manure spreader to fit your operation. Find out more at the H&S website.
Welcome back. Well, it has been a really active stretch of severe weather across the U.S. April marked the second highest number of tornadoes on record in the U.S., and severe weather has been reported every single day so far this month. And Martin Loudermore joins us now with a look at your forecast as we close out May. Martin?
Hey there, everyone. Yeah, we are going to be looking at seeing the possibility for some better conditions over the next several days for a little bit of the rainfall. We haven't seen much in some parts of the country. Drought monitor sitting across parts of western Kansas sees that winter wheat. A lot of that's there. They're wanting to get a little bit of rain before they harvest it up. And of course, almost the entirety of New Mexico sitting under that drought, especially the most southeastern corner. You see that little dark area there. It's the only part of the country sitting under exceptional drought. But when it comes to the big picture, a good portion of the country is sitting out of the drought monitor. So that is a good thing to see across most of the nation. It's just those couple areas of that winter wheat in parts of Kansas definitely need to see some of that rainfall. You can see it very closely. Only part of the country sitting under the exceptional. But again, plenty of rainfall for eastern Kansas as we have in the next couple of days. Unfortunately, not going to be seeing much in terms of that rainfall across western Kansas, but they could see a couple drops, which again, any will help across most of that part of the country. A lot of areas that don't necessarily need to see the rain are seeing that rainfall across the eastern portion of the country. And again, parts of Florida that do need to see that rainfall, not going to be seeing much as the high pressure is really dominating just to our south, causing for some triple-digit heat across southern Texas and southern Florida. So that flooding potential is going to be there as we get into our Monday. You can see that's where that rain's going to be. But we look at the jet stream, you can't really see the culprit of what's going on. Here's this trough that's going to be rolling its way through across parts of the country. This could spark up a couple of those stronger storms for our Sunday as we get into that storms for the Sunday and into your Monday. Those will move on into New England. Don't expect them to be that severe as they get there, but still plenty of rainfall expected for that Monday. But as we watch, low pressure here, high pressure down to the south, it's going to stay there, not going anywhere anytime soon because it's going to stay hot across the entirety of southern Texas and southern Florida. But as we get into the midweek, we start seeing this low really dipping down into New England. This could really be cooling off a good portion of New England and into parts of the Great Lakes where you're already watching for this high pressure ridge to really start giving way as we get into that Friday. There's that next low. So it could break down a little bit of that heat across the northern plains, but that high pressure not wanting to go anywhere across the southern plains and into parts of Texas and of course southern Florida where they're seeing triple-digit heat nearly every day of the week. Not even counting in that humidity that really makes it even feel even worse with that heat index. So make sure to be on the safe side if you're going to be heading out over the next several days in the southern part of the nation as that heat is unfortunately not going anywhere.
Thanks, Martin. Well, farmers in key states like Iowa and Illinois saw some impressive planting progress across the U.S. last week. So what are the markets really watching now? Brian Grady and Jim McCormick join me next. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this Memorial Day weekend. Well, as promised, we have Brian Grady as well as Jim McCormick joining us this weekend. Jim, when we look at the markets this week, we did see some pops. We saw some momentum. Was it supply or was it demand driven this week?
Right now, I think a lot of it, well, kind of it depends on which market you're looking at, Tyne. On the bean market, whole crop beans, it was probably a little bit of demand driven. China came in and bought at least 2 cargoes of beans. They're buying it off the P&W as a reserve buy because our beans are a little bit better quality. So that was a driver there. So on the demand on the beans, on the other side of the equation, corn and wheat, I think that was more of a supply situation, worried about delayed plantings as well as dryness issues in Russia.
Brian, look at the wheat market. It's also been impressive to watch the wheat market as of late. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned it, talking about the weather and the impact to Russia's crop. Is that still what's driving this market?
Yeah, I think from a fundamental standpoint, it is time. And you know, on top of the dryness that Jim mentioned, we had the frost and freeze early this month. And so, you know, ongoing damage assessments there in terms of how much it means. But really, I'm not sure it changes the market fundamentally as much as it just gave the funds a reason to cover short positions. And we've seen that the money flow has definitely changed over the past 4 to 6 weeks or so in the grain and soy markets.
Well, taking a look at the U.S. crop, a lot of, focus on planting progress. And USDA said as of Sunday, 70% of the corn had been planted. That's up 21 points from the week prior. 52% of soybeans are now planted, Jim. We crossed that halfway point. That was up 17 points in a week. Did that catch the market by surprise?
I think it did a little bit. I mean, I was looking for it to be up pretty big time because the reality is we can get this crop in a lot quicker than we did 5-10 years ago. But yeah, when you look at the average trade guesses to what the actual number was, we were a little bit more aggressive than the trade was thinking. Now the question is how much is going to get done now. The weather, I think right now is a little bit mixed going into the holiday weekend. The traders trying to brace for a very wet Memorial Day weekend, but the 6 to 10 day forecast suggests that maybe we get a better window to maybe get some more stuff planted here at the very end of May. So, still a lot of weather volatility to play out as we try to get the final bit of this crop planted.
Well, Brian, I mean, when you look at where those impressive gains were made, Illinois, corn planting shot up 25 points in a week. Iowa planting there for corn jumped up 21 points in a week. I mean, I knew we had some small windows, but my gosh, did that surprise you just how much progress we had made in a week's time?
Well, those were the key areas where we were lagging on the planting, so they needed to make a jump, and still really wet here across the central Corn Belt, and that's the critical area. Now, I'm not concerned on acreage. 90 million, I think that USDA projected in March was too low to begin with, and so even if we shave off a few of the corn acres as we get up against the crop insurance planting date, I still think that the acreage number will be up from what the March intentions were when all said and done.
Jim, I know weather's always a wild card, but as we look at this quick transition to La Nina, is this something that the market's watching?
It's definitely looking at what it's watching, and it's going to really depend on how quick it comes, Tyne. Some of the models say we're going to hit this heat and dryness by early part of July. Other models are putting it toward the latter part of August into September. The later that transition comes, the more likely we are going to have trendline yield. So, but yeah, we're going to be, we're in a weather market, traditional weather market. In the spring, we'll probably get a secondary one in July, August as we debate to see if this rain does come. But the other thing to keep in mind is we are looking for a record active hurricane season. So we could still have some dryness issues, but the hurricanes come through the Gulf and go right up the Mississippi River, which has happened from time to time. That could also solve some of the dryness issues that may start to develop. So we need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, Brian, I mean, we've made some impressive progress when it comes to the soil moisture profile, especially in your backyard, looking at parts of Iowa that had struggled with moisture. Now it's too much moisture this year. But what areas do you think are in the best shape leading into summer? What areas are in the worst shape?
Oh, I think I'll start with the worst shape because that's right in my backyard, northeast Iowa down into central Iowa. We were really dry. We've received about 10 to 15 inches of rainfall over the past 5 weeks through that area broadly. And so we're sitting in a really good situation right now from a moisture standpoint, actually excessive in some of these areas. But we'll probably need it, as Jim talked about. The key is that transition from neutral conditions to La Nina, and when it happens, and as is the case with most things in commodities, timing is everything, and so that'll be critical as we move through the summer. But we're going to need that moisture, increased moisture profile as we move forward, I think, through the growing season here.
All right, well, we've seen some cuts to the production forecast in South America. We'll take a look at that. Plus, cash cattle trade heading into the Memorial Day weekend. We'll talk about that coming up next. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Jim, when you look at the International Grains Council, it lowered its global corn production forecast by 6 million metric tons. We've seen some cuts to key growing areas in Brazil. When you look at this forecast, has this picture changed dramatically when you look at the possibility of increasing the amount of corn acres that we have in the U.S. come June?
Plain and simple, they did make some cuts, but when you look at the overall supply in the world, Tyne, I think it looks very comfortable. I'm with Brian in the fact earlier when he said that the corn acres are probably going to increase a little bit. I think when they did the survey in March, the farmer was pretty down on the economic situation. I think he bounced back. I think a good majority of the corn is going to get in. And if we get anywhere close to trend line yields, we're going to have more than enough. And then demand, I think, Tyne, is still a real question. You look at what China said. The USDA says China is going to import 23 million metric tons of corn. The Chinese say they're going to import 13 million metric tons. Same thing on the beans. I think there's about an 8-9 difference between the USDA's import for China's versus the Chinese viewpoint. So, if China's viewpoint is correct that they don't need as many products as what the USDA thinks, that could have a huge ramification on the bearish side for the balance sheet.
All right, Brian, let's switch gears a little bit to cattle, because as we head into the Memorial Day weekend, big time for demand and grilling. But through cash negotiations, they've been slow to develop in most areas. But according to Pro Farmer, Brian, you guys say it appears the average cash cattle price will challenge or eclipse the all-time high of $189.56 posted in March. Some impressive cash action that we've seen this week.
Absolutely, and probably even more impressive than the cash action has been wholesale beef prices just on fire here recently, and really, you know, the domestic demand is pulling this market, and we need it because the exports aren't very good on the beef side of things, and so what we have is that demand is keeping up. The supply situation remains bullish for cattle because we know that they continue to tighten up there. Feedlot supplies are going to remain tight as we move into 2025. And so really the question mark on the cattle and beef side of things is on demand, and domestic demand for now is strong. It needs to be because we're into that key time frame. Once we get past the beef holidays this summer, then it backs off quite a bit traditionally.
Jim, strong domestic demand, and the Feds are still confident inflation will ease, but a new survey shows more than half of Americans think that the United States is in a recession, although gross domestic product has been increasing for the past several years. So for consumers, they have a lack of confidence in the economy, yet we're still seeing demand for things like meat products strong.
Well, I think what you're seeing, Tyne, is essentially a kind of a dichotomy of what people think and what they believe. And what I mean by that is you ask a consumer, they say, well, what do you think the economy, like you said, they say it's not good. And then you say, well, what are you going to do? Well, guess what? They're going on vacation. We're looking for a record amount of people traveling over Memorial Day weekend. Airlines are saying that, you know, record amount of travel. So even though the consumer may say, I'm worried about the economy, they're spending like they're not concerned about the economy. And that's going to be the key to the cattle market near term. If that consumer continues to spend like he has for the last year and a half coming out of the pandemic, it should be supportive, at least near term.
Thanks, Jim and Brian. All right, up next, we have a custom-built tractor that rides in memory of the man who built it, celebrating him and the work he did to keep a tradition alive. That's this Memorial Day weekend. Next.
Watch Markets Now with Michelle Rook on the Farm Journal YouTube channel, keeping you updated throughout the day on the markets at the open, midday, and close. Find out what moved the markets today and what to expect the market to do next.
Hey folks, welcome back to Tractor Tales. This week we're off to northern Indiana to check out a 1925 John Deere E Hit and Miss tractor. Now, this tractor was restored in memory of a good friend and has special meaning to the collector.
What we have here is a 1925 John Deere Model E Hit and Miss tractor. It's riding on a 1964 wheel horse chassis. It's one of 14 that was built back in the late 70s and early 80s. It was built by a good friend of mine and his father, Roger Tinney, and his dad, Hugo. They began in 1963, and they just had a passion for hit and miss engines and wanted a good way to take them to shows and display them. Hugo came up with a way of mounting these engines on a tractor chassis to make them a little bit easier to move around and drive them, and ultimately make them a better display piece. Roger and I go way back. I'd known him about 25 years. He started to fall into declining health. He sadly passed away on April 12th of this year. But June of last year was the Classic Green reunion. Model E Hit and Miss engines were one of the features that they had down there. So I knew that Roger still had this tractor, and I asked him one day if I could take that tractor down and show it there on his behalf. And over the course of this past winter, I took it and completely disassembled it. I sandblasted everything that needed to be down to bare metal and gave it a professional level restoration, and continue to show it on his behalf, and hope to continue to do so. Well, Roger had a little club that called itself the Americana Antique Engine Society, and today it's defunct, but Roger was the self-proclaimed leader of it and did a good job. Today in parades and shows, I still carry around the sign and the banner that say Americana Antique Engine Society in his memory. He had a passion, and that passion was preserving the industrial history of our nation. He wanted to pass this on to the next generation, and that's something that I feel is extremely important. And I do this for him. His spirit lives on with this tractor, and so help me, I will show it as long as I can.
Thanks, Greg. There's no doubt the dairy industry is shrinking as the number of dairies decline. How could the dairy industry change? Well, it's a glimpse at the state of the dairy industry next.
You're watching U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition. The State of the Dairy Industry Report on U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by M-Power Dairy from Merck Animal Health. Only Merck Animal Health combines technology and biopharma products for a true full solution approach to dairy management. See how at m-power-dairy.com. And by Rabo AgriFinance. Discover how local relationship managers and global sector expertise can help you address challenges and seize opportunities. Rabo AgriFinance. Let's talk. Learn more at www.raboag.com.
Welcome back. Well, Farm Journal just released its State of the Dairy Industry 2024 report. It surveyed 210 dairy producers throughout the U.S. More than 2/3 reported 5 years of profitability, and more than half have a growth mindset with plans to expand in the next 5 years. Farm Journal's Michelle Rook talked to a leading dairy economist to get his insights about what it means for the future of dairy.
The dairy space has always been tough, but our State of the Dairy Industry study shows that it's not going to get any easier over the next 3 to 5 years due to a host of variables, including things like higher input costs and ag labor. And that's why consolidation will continue at a breathtaking pace, and dairy producers need to be proactive. The latest USDA Census of Ag showed around 24,000 dairy operations in 2022, down 39% from 2017 and 50% from 2012. And EverAg Insights President Phil Flory says extrapolating that trend to 2027 takes operations down another 20 to 25%. Dairies with 2,500 plus cows now account for more than 50% of operations, and over 60% of the milk comes from dairies 1,000 head or more.
And what it says is that for the dairy producers that are still here, it's a dogfight. It is a street fight in terms of figuring out ways to stay relevant, to get more productive, to stay out of the curves, to manage risk better, because it's never been an easy business. It's not going to be an easy business anytime soon.
Dairy producers surveyed indicate the biggest challenges for the future are the pay price for milk, ag labor, and the cost of inputs.
We've had a couple of years here of, relatively elevated feed prices. We certainly know that labor is more expensive, just sort of general inflation right around operations.
South Dakota dairy producer Lynn Bodwine says the pay price for milk has improved lately, but it's been a real headwind, and there's no guarantees for the future.
We've really been in a year and a half of crippling low prices, negative margins. It's started to improve now. We haven't got our first checks, but it needs to improve.
To overcome those challenges, Flory says maximizing productivity presents a better chance of profitability.
The investment needs to continue. Genomics, genetics, making the best productivity decisions we can around breeding, and then feeding, and then housing, and just, it's sort of a, the investment in productivity has to be there because productivity is profit at the end of the day, right?
He says dairy producers also need to proactively deploy risk management tools. Producers maximizing dairy margin coverage received close to $150,000 in 2023.
DMC can go a long way to providing real meaningful protection to a farm's profitability. And the cost of it is, it's sort of a no-brainer in terms of what it takes to get involved with DMC. So at a minimum, that's a nice safety net for, up to 200 threaded cow producers.
For 200-plus cow operations, Plord says dairy revenue protection paid out more than $500 million in net indemnities in 2023, and it's the key for staying in business.
It's a great product because you're basically at subsidized put options, at a very, very high level. That's what we're dealing with. And so you're able to protect downside and keep the upside net of what it costs you for the insurance.
Beyond that, he says the dairy industry is becoming increasingly dependent on exports, and farmers are losing out with the lack of a robust trade agenda.
I just think from a political perspective, I think that farmers generally need to keep banging on the drum with their legislators and representatives that, ag trade is really, really important to the American farmer.
He also recommends cashing in on climate opportunities, leveraging data and technology, and investing in protein innovation.
One of our focuses is cow comfort, animal health, and getting the most out of each individual animal. And that in itself, lowers our carbon footprint.
But he's taken it one step further, working with Brightmark to install a methane digester.
It was a pretty easy decision. Less odor, a treatment system, and especially with the world so tuned in on sustainability.
Plus, it's an opportunity for a new revenue stream for the operation that will help him stay viable for the future. I'm Michelle Rook for U.S. Farm Report.
Well, some dairy farmers are finding new ways to grow, and that's not just in size, but what they produce. We'll show you one farmer finding success with beef on dairy later. But first, avian flu concerns in China. A glimpse of ag around the globe is next. Now for a glimpse of ag around the world. Cases of avian flu in animals have now been confirmed in western China. The country's ag ministry confirming 275 cases of avian flu among dead gulls and other wild birds. News of the outbreak comes as Beijing says its Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs is under investigation. Bloomberg reporting the country's anti-graft agency is investigating Tang Renjian for, quote, serious violations of the law. Tang was appointed the ag minister in December of 2020. The 62-year-old also headed China's food security campaign. And Australia is reporting its first human case of H5N1. Health officials report it involves a child who contracted the virus in India but has since recovered. Additionally, they report an unidentified H7 strain has been found on an egg farm in Melbourne. It is suspected to have originated from wild birds. They say infected birds will be culled and movement restrictions have been imposed around the farm. An update on the flooding in southern Brazil. The area has recently seen half a year's worth of rain in about a week. The area has seen between 10 to 20 inches of rain in some places. And as we've told you, the flooding has been widespread, killing dozens of people. And it couldn't come at a worse time for farmers there.
It was untimely, to say the least, for crops such as corn, soybeans, and rice. All of them are being harvested right now.
For instance, USDA estimates a 1 million ton reduction in Brazilian soybean production from the previous month. That's due to flooding in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. And also in that state following the floods, hog farmers lost an estimated 12,600 head. One expert in the area reporting some 30 farms were impacted, including those of suppliers to BRF and JBS. The losses calculated at more than $35 million. The state accounts for almost 25% of overall Brazilian pork exports. It's amazing what robots can do these days, including saving your life. Sony unveiling a new surgical robot tool using an ear of corn to show off exactly what it can do. More precisely, it used a kernel of corn, and we mean precision. This is a prototype that was recently unveiled at the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers International Conference in Japan. Just watch this for a moment, as the robot is able to first cut that tiny corn kernel and then run stitches through it. It works by replicating the movements of the surgeon's hands and fingers. The delicate instrument can work in conjunction with a microscope to repair small tissues, veins, and even nerves. Sony says it will work with university medical departments and institutions to help make them more available and accessible to doctors, taking smart farming and smart surgery to a whole new level. Impressive. Well, that's a look at ag around the world. Well, the weather here at home is creating hurdle after hurdle for getting this year's crop planted. But what are the sins of spring that Ken Ferry is seeing right now? That's Chip's Corner next.
Chip's Corner on U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Full Scale from Helena. Grow strong returns this season with breakthrough foliar nutrition from Full Scale at Reproduction.
Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Chip Flory for Chip's Corner. Chip, I know we've talked quite a few weeks about policy, but let's switch gears now and talk about crops, because this planting season has been challenging, to say the least, for a lot of people. I've seen some fields, some yellow corn just from all the leaching that's happened with all of this wet weather, and the amount of weed escapes out there. I mean, some fields, Chip, are just plain ugly this year.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no question about it. And obviously the weather has a whole lot to do with some of the challenges that farmers are facing in the field out there this year. But some of the things come down to management as well, and different choices. And the thing is, the weather can make a management choice a bad choice after the fact. And we know that, and we understand that. It doesn't change the fact that some of the things are happening out there. You mentioned the weed escapes. Earlier this week on AgriTalk, I talked with Ken Ferry for the Farm Journal agronomist, Crop Tech Consulting, and he mentioned the weed escapes. And the thing is, Tyne, Ken was talking about the 2024 planting season as something completely unique and different than what he has ever seen. And for Ken Ferry to be talking about how unique a season is, it's really got to be something unique out there, and that accounts for some of the challenges that farmers are dealing with. And Ken's always referred to it as something special in the spring of the year.
We call it the sins of spring, right? When we get out and we're working this ground wet. And this past week, there was a lot of sins committed down here. We've got a lot of ground that got worked wet in a panic to get it planted. And then we end up with a lot of clods. And then yesterday we had dust storms down here. Were crazy. Unfortunately, those compaction layers that we were laying in to get this thing planted are going to haunt us in July, August.
Deeper into the year, you and I have talked about the weather issues that we're dealing with, this transition from El Nino back to La Nina. If we've got a fairly shallow rooted crop out there, and La Nina sets in later in the growing season, and we've got a dry half of the growing season with that layer of compaction down there, Tyne, that's going to be a big issue that could be a yield limiting factor as we make our way through the harvest season. And here's the thing, it's that compaction layer is not just a problem for this year. As Ken said, as a lot of growers are making transitions in their production practices, don't forget that you laid that layer of compaction in there in the spring of 2024. When you're making some of those changes in your production practices, you got to fix that problem before you go forward and change the production practices.
Yeah, not to mention some of the cover crops that need to be killed, and some of these farmers that have had challenges doing that. And I know that Ken's talked about that as well. So another layer onto this. Well, Chip Flory, thank you so much for joining us this Memorial Day weekend. You can hear Chip every morning at 10 a.m. for AgriTalk AM and 2 p.m. Central for AgriTalk PM. All right, when we come back, there's a lot of things that dairy farmers are exploring right now, from some of these climate smart programs to also new opportunities to cash in on. Beef on dairy is one of those. We traveled to Indiana to talk to one producer who was kind of on the leading edge of that. We'll do that next. Well, earlier in the show, Michelle Rook had a look at the state of the dairy industry, and there's no doubt dairy producers have faced major headwinds the past couple years with milk prices. But one area of opportunity is beef on dairy. And as we show you this weekend, it's an opportunity in which dairy producers of all sizes are cashing in.
We reuse the sand, and then it all goes through a manure separator.
Finding efficiency at every level.
And then the sand, it goes through another separator and takes out all of the solid manure, so we can utilize that on fields.
is one way this fourth-generation dairy producer has learned to thrive.
And then the liquid will go back out to our lagoons, and then it will cycle back through, flush our floors, and then eventually we'll take the lagoon water and irrigate it out on our fescue to help us grow crops.
Because on this 1,100-cow Indiana dairy farm, there is no waste.
I think it's one of the coolest things about dairy farms in general is that we just recycle everything.
Alex Neuenschwander says when they expanded and built the new barn in 2019, they also modernized their dairy.
Using modern technology has been a huge thing to help us be more efficient. We're utilizing sensors on the cows. We're utilizing AI technology on cameras that are constantly watching the cows, so we can make fast, informed decisions, just as quick as we need to. And that has really helped us become more efficient, streamline some labor, and just getting us where we need to be so that we can work the most efficiently as possible, too.
Another game changer, according to Neuenschwander, is the focus of beef on dairy.
70% of our cows we use for beef on dairy, so they'll have a beef calf that's marketable from day one.
He says by breeding for beef, it's bringing even more value back to their dairy farm, fueling another revenue stream.
The buyer will come in 2 or 3 times a week and buy all of the baby calves that are beef calves. It's really a high value-added enterprise for sure. They just bring a lot of value back to the dairy.
The team at Farm Journal's Dairy Herd just released a State of the Dairy report, which was based off a survey of more than 200 dairy producers. The survey found 59% of dairy operations are breeding for beef on dairy, and just over half are raising them.
Well, it began really as we came into 2019, 2020. We saw, especially in the COVID years, a lot of disruption in the supply chain around beef.
That, coupled with the drought in the West and South, sparked a new opportunity for dairy farmers to cash in.
Today, we have some of the highest on-farm prices for cattle that we've seen in history. Day-old beef calves are, selling for $900 to $1,000 right off of the farm.
Mike North says in 2020, those calves were virtually worth nothing.
At the time, we had plenty of replacement heifers, and dairymen said, you know what, we're just going to start breeding some of our lower genomic testing cows to beef and putting beef semen in them.
We breed our best cows to sex semen and the lower end ones to beef semen, and then we can improve our genetics off of our highest cows, mated with the best bulls, and everything else is a valuable beef calf. So it's a win-win for us.
From more consistent carcasses to high-quality beef, North says beef on dairy has become big business and one that isn't going away.
With the advent of genomics, with sexed beef semen, with improved bull selection and availability of beef semen, and pricing that is providing a great incentive against a beef herd that likely isn't going to grow much either.
The State of the Dairy Industry report also found, despite a mountain of challenges for dairy farmers, more than half plan to grow in one way or another over the next 5 years.
It could be more cows. It could be this beef on dairy discussion that we had, and adding another enterprise to the operation. Maybe it's feed security and moving towards growing all of my own forages. Either way, I'm going to have to create new growth inside my operation to be able to accommodate the arrival of the next generation and or to overcome some of the margin compression that we've had over these last many years.
As dairy farmers like Neuenschwander continue to ride the volatility of milk prices, they're looking for growth any way they can, even if that growth is measured in many different ways.
Dairy farms are getting better all the time. It used to be that, let's say we were making 80 pounds of milk and we thought that was good. Now you need to be making 90 pounds of milk for it to be good. It's just dairy farms are getting way more efficient.
Alex actually has a big job off the farm this weekend. That's because he's the 2024 Indy 500 Milkman. That's the individual who will deliver the coveted glass of milk to the winning driver this weekend. So a toast to that tradition. We'll do that next. A dairy tradition will be waiting at the finish line again this weekend for the winner of the Indy 500. The winner of the race will be given a delicious bottle of milk to quench their thirst. It's a tradition that started after the 1936 race when driver Louis Meyer requested buttermilk to drink then. But since then, an Indiana dairy farmer has been in the winner's circle to hand off a cool glass of moo juice to the winner. Each year, 2 dairy producers in the state are selected to carry out that honor, and this year's producer selected to hand over that ice-cold bottle to the winning driver is Alex, who we just introduced you to with our Beef on Dairy look. He's located in Bluffton, Indiana. The rookie in training this year is Abby Herr of South Whitley, Indiana. Next year, she'll be giving the bottle to the first driver to cross the finish line. So what do the Indy 500 drivers prefer? Well, it's clear that this year's field of drivers have some definite opinions on what they would like to be served if they win the race. 26 drivers selected whole milk, 5 want 2%, and 2 drivers selected skim. Indiana Dairy says all 3 options will be available. Well, what about chocolate milk? I'm letting you in on a little fun fact this weekend. It was never an option at the Indy 500, and buttermilk that we mentioned earlier is no longer an option for drivers either. Well, that's all the time we have this weekend on U.S. Farm Report. Thank you so much for watching this Memorial Day. I hope you enjoy a glass of milk, grill out, do all the good things this weekend for this holiday. We hope that you join us again next weekend as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.